Welcome to Censored. I'm Aoife Vertnach, a historian who prefers to read novels over proper history books, hence this podcast. If you check out the show notes, you'll find links to my Patreon if you want ad-free episodes and some extras. You can also share the episode with a friend. Spread the filth around a bit. This episode is about The Bell, a magazine published in Dublin between 1940 and 1954, apart from when it stopped briefly between 1948 and 50. Yonks ago, when I was doing my PhD research, I read a few issues of The Bell, but it wasn't directly relevant, so I had to leave it aside. I was pretty devastated because The Bell is so bracing compared to the newspapers I had to read. The magazine's content includes journalistic-style exposés of social issues like slum life. Then there were think pieces on censorship alongside poetry and short stories. Its two editors were famous in their own right. The second editor, Peadar O'Donnell, was one of Ireland's few socialist intellectuals. The Bell's first editor was Sean O'Fuil, who I've talked about lots in the podcast. He was the author of a few banned books. See my episode on Bird Alone back along for more on that. And he was also a loud critic of the censors, who didn't conceal his disgust at the volume and range of works banned by the state. So, for example, in 1942, the pages of The Bell were full of editorials, letters and essays critically interrogating the censorship regime. When he sought contributions for the magazine, he wrote about breaking silences and opening up debate. The terms of these appeals suggest a culture that was pretty reluctant to speak up. So the magazine explicitly attacked state censorship, but it also tried to challenge social censure and the broader culture of silence. Oddly, for such a controversial magazine, The Bell was never banned, even though the censors could and did blacklist magazines. The authors who wrote for it, like Brendan Behan and Kate O'Brien, were banned as novelists, but the censors ignored them when they wrote for The Bell. It's strange because it seems like the sort of magazine that would automatically piss off the censors. But then what if the censors didn't need to ban everything? Were there other forces that marginalised criticism? And what about questions of form? Did the way something was said make a difference? To discuss the wonderful world of The Bell, I'm joined by Phyllis Boumans from the University of Leuven, who is writing her PhD on the relationship between magazine culture and the short story, focusing particularly on The Bell. Hi Phyllis, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Hi Aoife, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
Great. I'm looking forward to learning more about The Bell. I have read occasional issues of The Bell, but I've never gone into a deep dive of the magazine itself, so I think this could be a lot of fun. So the first thing I want to know, I suppose, The Bell is very well known in kind of scholarly circles. It gets quoted a lot. But who bought The Bell? Was it widely read at the time? Because it seems very famous now, posthumously.
Yeah, that's a good question. Who bought The Bell? It's a bit difficult to answer, I think, in a way, or rather difficult to answer properly because we don't have any well-kept ledgers with subscriber names, which we do actually have in the case of Irish Writing, for example, by David Marcus. He kept a very neat list of all his subscribers. But for The Bell, we don't have any documentation as to the occupations or geographical locations of subscribers. So we can't really make any definite claims about its actual readers, but we do get a fairly good picture, I think, of its intended or its ideal audience by studying the editorials and the advertisements. So judging from the magazine's opening editorial, as well as subsequent editorials, it's very clear that the magazine sought to address a very broad spectrum of readers. And the phrase, "we are absolutely inclusive," was a phrase that it opened with and that would return in subsequent editorials. So it really wanted to attract a diverse body of readers from north to south, Protestant and Catholic, from urban Dublin to, rural Tipperary, for example. And the Bell really was to be a kind of home for all these different voices. And so in the opening editorial, again, by O'Fuelan, which he is a telling phrase in itself, really, he called the opening editorial, "This is your magazine." He really tried to mobilize readers from all corners of the island by addressing them directly by saying, and I'm quoting here, "Whoever you are then, O reader, Gentile or Jew, Protestant or Catholic, priest or layman, big house or small house, the Bell is yours." So this broad readership very much corresponded with the magazine's founding principle, which was based on the idea, that Ireland and its population was made up of or influenced by many different strands of Irish identity. So you had the Gaelic strand and the Norman and Anglo-Irish and English and etc. And that these different strands had left their mark on Irish culture and Irish identity. And in that same vein, the Bell also tried to challenge this idea of a Catholic monomania by giving space to voices from different religious denominations, so not just the Catholic one. So it featured articles on what it meant to be a Jew, a Quaker or Presbyterian in Ireland. And the idea was then that this very diverse readership would send in contributions very realistically describing their corner of Irish life as they lived it, as they knew it and experienced it. And then taken together, these pieces would create a kind of collage or snapshots of actual life as it was lived on the island, as a kind of antidote or challenge to the narrow romantic view of Gaelic, rural, Catholic Ireland. So these three pillars of Irish identity that were propagated by De Valera, and to replace that then with a more pluralist and more complex view of Irish identity. So that was then, let's say, the readership that it strove to address. In reality, I think it was not that inclusive. Its readership consisted mostly, I'd say, of middle class to lower middle class, small town intellectuals. Conor Cruise O'Brien, he described the Bell's readers at the time as teachers, librarians, junior civil servants, so the lettered section of the Irish bourgeoisie. And then to further qualify this aim, this desire to be inclusive, it predominantly targeted male readers, which is visible from the articles that it published and also from the advertisements that it carried. So for banks and for insurance companies and those things, which would have spoken more to the male segments of society, and the vast majority of contributors was male. So it really was a magazine by, for and about men. But yeah, generally speaking, I think we can say it was the small town intellectuals that would have bought and read the Bell.
It's interesting you say the small town, because of course the editors are based in Dublin, aren't they? And it's published in Dublin. And I suppose a lot of the mainstream media are based in Dublin, the Independent and the Press and the Irish Times. And I just think that's really interesting that it's a more diffuse readership, imagined and in actuality. Seeing as I live in, what's considered regional Ireland, it's nice that there's something that broadens the perspective a little bit. And so how did the readers in these small towns and cities, how did they get a copy of the Bell for themselves? Did they write away for it, like a subscription through the post, or did they go to the local newsagent? How did they buy it?
In both ways, both of the ways that you mentioned there. So readers could procure copies by subscription through the post, and they could also buy copies at the newsagents, either as regular customers that would ask them to, get their monthly copy, or as just individual purchases. And, that sounds very straightforward. I guess it sounds that you could easily get your hands on a copy. I think in reality that may have been a bit more difficult. I think, generally speaking, books in rural Ireland were hard to come by because the number of good bookshops outside of Dublin and Belfast was very limited. So that in itself is already an obstacle, I think, for readers who would want to get the Bell. And then on top of that, libraries and bookshops also often actually self-censored. So they would refuse to stock, as I'm sure you know, they would refuse to stock works that they thought were, pernicious to the mind so I remember actually going through some of the Bell's copies at the National Library and then finding that a page had been torn out of a story that dealt with illegitimacy. So, even if you managed to get, to read a copy at the library, maybe somebody had been there before you and removed something that they hadn't agreed with.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how people appointed themselves censors of other people's reading. Absolutely.
Yeah, so definitely that shows that the Bell fell within that kind of category of what was considered suspicious. So the magazine really had this aura of kind of contraband around it. O'Whalan himself had become a kind of byword for promoting evil literature, and he'd been banned twice himself before he started the Bell. And I remember reading in a memoir by Brian McMahon, the famous storyteller from Kerry, and was also a school teacher, and he contributed many stories to the Bell. I remember reading in his memoir that his association with the magazine was viewed with suspicion by some of the local clerical authorities, and also in a memoir by Honor Tracy, the British writer. She worked as an editorial assistant for the Bell, who describes similarly that they were an object of suspicion in some quarters. And she describes as one day when she was alone at the office of the Bell, and then somebody she describes as a clerical spy came snooping around the office and kind of shouting at her, "You're all communists in here, and you're all anti-clerical in here." So it was definitely a controversial publication. And then, I mean, just as its association alone with literature was already suspicious, but also for the way, of course, it tried to advocate for frank and honest treatment of taboo topics. So, if censorship was a way of protecting people from the realities of their lives, the Bell's mission was precisely to uncover these realities, to actually talk about these things that would usually get the kind of hush-hush treatment. So it wanted to start public discussion about controversial issues that challenged the teachings of the Catholic Church. And so what to do with our illegitimate children, for example, was one of the things O'Whalan wanted to discuss. Or it wanted to talk about the declining birth rates, for example, and what lay at the root of that. So in some areas, especially in small towns, as we were talking about small towns, the magazine was surreptitiously sold from under the counter, covered in a kind of a protective wrapper, and then passed between newsagent and customer, with the cover facing downwards, also with a kind of furtiveness that is now associated with pornography. So this whole transaction had a kind of conspiratorial air around it. So that was, I guess, how readers could get a copy of the Bell, but it was also, of course, passed along between readers. And O'Whalan himself, he liked to boast that, each copy would go through at least 10 hands. And so the actual, the print run would be 3,000 issues per copy, more or less. And he, kind of thought, actually in reality that would have been closer to 30,000. But, of course, this is the self-promotion and the kind of hubris maybe of the editor. But on the other hand, there's also an account by Dermot Foley, the librarian from County Clare, who has written about how he noticed that copies of the Bell would be kind of secretly passed on between librarians and teachers in small country villages.
It sounds like the sort of thing you had to know what it was in order to get hold of it. So someone had to tell you and give you a copy, and then maybe you could order it and get it, like the Dirty Magazine. So it was in a way quite confined that way, that you couldn't just walk in and see it on a shelf.
No, I doubt that, yes.
That's just fascinating. Maybe that's why they didn't need to ban it, because it was a restricted readership already. And can you tell me some more about the tone and the style of the magazine? I mean, periodicals have a voice that emerges as you read many issues, and that's part of the problem with my censorship bingo from the novels. You can't really do a censorship bingo on 10 years of a periodical to work out why they censored it. And the Bell had two unusual taglines, didn't it? Its first was a magazine of creative fiction, and then it said a survey of Irish life. Now, they seem quite different. as aims. How did it manage those two ambitious agendas?
So yes, you're absolutely right that there's definitely that mix of these two agendas. So on the one hand, the Bell really wanted to document life, to show life as it was, and it had that strong sociological character, which makes sense because sociology as a discipline hadn't really established itself at the time, and that role was then taken on by writers. And the Bell is also often credited with kind of hibernicizing this documentary mode that under the mass observation movement in Britain was already prominent there. So in that spirit, it promoted citizen journalism with pieces such as I Live in a Slum or 2 Years in a Sanatorium or The Life of a Country Doctor or I Wanted to Be a Nurse. So these kind of articles that really show that the magazine wanted to represent life in the present and not an idealized version of it. So that would correspond with the tagline, A Survey of Irish Life, which it really began with. And you also saw that they tried to not just represent this present reality, but also to change it, to improve it. So there were also more essayistic kind of pieces on prison reform or on architecture or city planning that really sought to transform society for the better. So you had that dimension on the one hand, and then on the other hand, O'Whellan had very strong literary ambitions also for the Bell, so it very much also wanted to be a literary magazine. And O'Whellan in particular, more so than O'Donnell, I would say, felt that the literary standards in his country were poor, and he wanted to revitalise Irish literature by finding new literary forms for this new literature and by mentoring young aspiring writers. So apart from these documentary pieces, the Bell also printed poetry, novel extracts, it had a monthly book review section, and it published lots of short stories, and the short story really became the kind of mainstay in the Bell's literary revitalization project. So every issue contained on average 2 stories, it had a short story competition, it had a special issue devoted to the genre. And so O'Whellan really tried to emphasize this literary side and to promote the modern short story as the new genre for Ireland. And he also published a series of essays actually on how to write modern short stories. So he was very didactic, and it wouldn't come as a surprise, I think, that he trained as a teacher. And he would sometimes even rewrite their work. Much to their dismay, and he would select a story that was printed in that issue, and then he would actually write a page of advice on, what was good about it and how it could be improved. So it had these two agendas, the documentary and the literary. I don't think necessarily that the Bell was very unique in that. Up until mid-20th century, I'd say magazines often had a mixture of culture and literature and politics. And it's only after mid-20th century, I think, that these kind of bifurcate along either or. Having said that, though, I think that this line between being a magazine of creative fiction and a survey of Irish life, it wasn't always very clear-cut. It wasn't always so very easy to separate between these pieces. And I think that many of the rules that O'Whellan imposed on the documentary writing, because he really had a very specific view of how he wanted things, he also imposed these on the short stories and vice versa. So they both had to be of the same length. They couldn't contain generalizations or vague ideas. They had to be rooted in close observation. Spring from personal feeling and lived experience. And so the generic boundaries between these two contributions, they were sometimes a bit hazy. And I think that this, the fact that you can't really easily distinguish or separate these two ambitions, I think, is also clear in the kind of taboo topics that the Bell wanted to draw attention to. So editorials would frequently encourage writers to take up controversial topics and really try to fight against the country's inability to approach life frankly. So in one editorial, for example, O'Whellan would encourage writers to take up topics such as birth control, unmarried mothers, illegitimacy, homosexuality, prostitution, venereal disease, so very progressive. And these have often been understood as pertaining to the documentary pieces or the essays, which is understandable because it printed essays and pieces of experience about these topics. But you also find that these topics they also return in the short fiction that the Bell published. So there are a number of stories on homosexuality, for example. Yeah, so there are a number of stories in the Bell that would, for example, deal with homosexuality. So there was a story Girls by Velma Kearns about 3 girls living in a boarding house together, and then one of these girls turns out to have lesbian feelings for one of her flatmates. And in another story, we have a story about a male nurse working in a TB ward that turns out to have feelings for a boy patient. There were many stories also about illegitimacy. In The Rustle of Spring, for example, there's a girl that flees from Dublin to her cousins in the countryside with her son, her illegitimate son, under the pretext that she was widowed. But then when she's exposed in the end, she's sent away by this family. Then there is a beautiful, very interesting story by Mary Beckett. The story is called Teresa, in which a young girl in Northern Ireland, she sleeps with a black soldier from the US that was stationed there during wartime, and she gives birth to a black child that she then keeps, and everybody in her community is very accepting.
Yeah, those stories sound amazing and very unexpectedly controversial, in that that's the sort of material the censors are coming down hard. It's extraordinary. To turn again to the kind of more journalistic aspects of the novel, and the fact, I find it fascinating that his editorial style was almost to kind of blend the two genres, the fiction and the eyewitness elements, that, you know, he's such an imposing personality as well, Sean O'Faolain. He really was an incredibly powerful ideologue in his own way. And so they discuss things, like you said, illegitimacy, which we have kind of tended to believe nobody talked about. And there was a real campaigning edge to that kind of contribution, wasn't there? But I noticed that some of those pieces were anonymous. Was that unusual at the time? Is it unusual in the context of the magazine and the fiction that was published?
I think it's not necessarily these socio-political pieces, for example, about prison reforms or the workhouses, that were anonymous. I think most of those anonymous pieces, they are really, as you say, these documents that tell of personal experience, and then they would sometimes be signed by a library assistant or a secondary school teacher, or for an article that was entitled "Speaking as an Orangeman." The signature at the end was one of them. You know, so this was obviously someone who didn't want their name printed there. And I'm not sure. I don't think that that's necessarily unusual. I think it may have been risky for people at the time to show these either murkier sides of Irish life or to represent an unpopular or controversial viewpoint. And I remember reading Vivian Mercier, the critic. He suggested that of those journalistic pieces, it's particularly those anonymous ones that were the best ones, he says, and perhaps then that, you know, you really needed this kind of anonymity to really uncover these darker sides, and maybe they just didn't want to be recognized by others for fear of social sanctions or to be ostracized or to endanger. That's not the right word. What would be a better word?
Endanger makes sense, actually. I mean, boycotts are a pretty terrible thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, to endanger family, colleagues, or neighbours, etc. And yes, you're absolutely right. You don't see that so much in the literary sections. But on the other hand, there were also many mid-century professional writers who also worked under pseudonyms. And I mean, now that's commonly known. I'm sure it was at the time as well. But I'm thinking of Frank O'Connor, who changed his name when his fellow librarian, Lennox Robinson, was forced to resign from the library, and they were both librarians on the basis of a story that was deemed blasphemous. And you had Conor Cruise O'Brien, who worked as a civil servant at the time, and in the Bell he wrote as Donald O'Donnell. And in a way, that's, I guess, also a feature of periodical publishing, which, in the, let's say, 19th century Victorian periodicals, contributors were often anonymous. And in the Bell, you also had a series of interviews that were run by the bellman, or you had a regular feature, the open window section, which was cultural criticism and personal opinion. That was printed under the pseudonym Gulliver, and this turned out to be Michael Farrell, but
so it's not particularly unusual, the anonymity that we see in the Bell. It's just interesting, I suppose, compared to now, when so many personal experience stories are rooted in people's actual real name, their real faces, and, there's a very definite shift in our culture of personal experience narration now, where the authenticity has to be grounded in an actual real person, no pseudonyms allowed. And so if we look at the literary content more closely then, I want to return to what you said about the short stories, because short stories have really started to catch my attention in these kind of magazines as a way that literature is disseminating under the nose of the censors, I think. I think that a short story as a form, and especially in magazines, was less controversial, weirdly. And it seems that in the Bell, a lot of famous Irish writers who are known for being banned, such as Brendan Behan, they wrote for the Bell, and you would think that maybe that might, draw attention, but the Bell was never actually censored by the state itself. Why do you think that was? What saved it?
Well, first of all, I guess we should maybe make a distinction in the sense that no, the Bell was never banned, but it was censored. That's an important distinction, I think, that we need to make here, because it was censored for its content, but it was only censored for its wartime content. Editorials, for example, that would refer to the political situation in Europe during the emergency period, they were censored. This article that I referred to earlier about what it means to be a Jew in Ireland, that was so heavily redacted by the censors that O'Foylan didn't want to publish it anymore, so he had to hold it over until after the war. And the Bell also planned to print a response to the Irish issue of Horizon. Horizon was kind of the British counterpart to the Bell, and they printed an Irish issue. So the Bell wanted to print an English issue, which they couldn't do because anything that was, sympathetic towards the Allied forces was not allowed to be printed. So in that sense, it was censored, but only for political censorship, wartime censorship, which is. It's interesting, as you say, because there was plenty of reason to be censored on moral grounds, and I think one of the reasons, perhaps, that the magazine wasn't banned was that most of these stories of that would take up these taboo topics, they were written in the short story genre, which was already a genre of minority interest. And different forms of artistic expression were also held to different standards. So theatre, for example, had no official censorship. Films, they attracted little attention because it was only starting to establish itself as an artistic medium. And I think that there was a general disregard for short stories, which was changing at that time. But it is true, short story collections weren't read very much. Of course, there were examples of short story collections that were banned. O'Foylan's debut collection, Midsummer Night Madness, Beckett's More Pricks Than Kicks, and also Nora Holt. Her short story collections were frequently banned. And you can't really easily compare, if you go through the lists of what was banned, you can't easily come up with some kind of ratio as to, novels and short story collections. But you do, as you leaf through these reports, you do get the impression that short story collections didn't really appear very easily on the censor's radar. And I also remember reading a comment by one of the censors, Professor McGuinness, I think, about Sean O'Foylan and Frank O'Connor saying, they didn't have the ability to write anything but short stories, and they were not able for the sustained work of a novel, so that really shows a kind of maybe disdain or disregard for that genre. So that minority interest of the genre definitely will have played a role, I think. And then on the other hand, I think it also has to do with the way that these stories in the Bell specifically relied on modernist short story techniques, which actually camouflaged their non-conformist content. So the short story genre in itself hinges very much on silences, is more about what it leaves unsaid, what it leaves out, than what is actually stated in the story. And this has been called the aesthetics of silence of the short story, or a kind of strategic reticence that the genre would employ, which very much has to do with the brevity of the form. So because it has to be short, it has to suggest things that have been left out. I think it was William Trevor who described the short story as the art of the glimpse, and that its strength lies in as much in what it leaves out as in what it puts in. And Claire Keegan, she's also said that the short story requires a discipline of omission. And I think that these kind of literary techniques, they help to elude, I think, the smutty passage marking practices of religious zealots, who would screen these books for their obscene content. And I think you would very easily miss these references if you're not really, well, maybe it's too strong to say trained in these conventions, but, you would really have to read the story properly, maybe read it twice sometimes to really to find out what it actually is about. And I think in that sense, it is no coincidence that it is precisely these poetics that are promoted in the Bell. So Ulf Whelan had a whole series on, as I said, on how to write modern short stories and how to use techniques such as suggestion and implication and omission. And he very adamantly urged writers that information must be conveyed in the most indirect manner possible in short stories. So I think that it's an interesting combination. So on the one hand, to promote these kinds of literary techniques, and to urge writers to talk about these taboo topics. So you'd find that these stories would, let's say, they would begin like in medias res, which is typical for modern short fiction to do, and so they wouldn't talk necessarily about this taboo topic. Let's say it's a short story about illegitimacy. This actual act of premarital sex would be skipped over entirely, and it would be more about the repercussions.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting that you can suggest more through the short story form just by virtue of its brevity, so that might mean leaving out words that a skimming reader would find. So the dirty-minded reader would be going through a page looking for the word thigh or the word breast, but if the short story writer is not going to use those words because they have chosen to hint or allude, or maybe just to talk about the aftermath, then you won't get the words. So just, like you say, the red pen. I love the idea that people are like skimming through it going, can't find anything. It's okay, whatever.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's this one story about an illegitimate child, and it never uses these words. It calls it that calamity, or the news had spread, or it had happened. And it really requires this kind of reading between the lines to figure out what is going on there. And this other story also about illegitimacy. So in this story, the illegitimate status of this child is only implied through a kind of faint blush that appears on the protagonist's cheeks when her cousin remarks, "Oh, you're too young to be widowed," because she has said, "Oh, it's not an illegitimate child; it's because the father had died." So yes, in that sense, I think that these techniques they don't go hand in hand. They don't.
And also, of course, that the way that the Censorship Act censored periodicals was so different to novels, wasn't it? Because it was a number of issues had to be considered contentious. So the dirty-minded reader had to find more than one occasion where something was discussed. And I think that must have been an important reason. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. as you say, they had to be regularly objectionable, which meant that they could offend with impunity in 6 out of 12 issues per year. And I actually tried to count for the magazine's run to see if they would maybe strategically try to, place these stories, but that's not the case. They really follow up on each other, so it's not that they try to avoid censorship in that way. But as you say, I mean, the banning of periodicals was very difficult, and these bans would only last 3 months, and there was always this time lag between, a formal complaint and the actual ban, which is ironic because, I don't know if it makes sense to say that because it's part of your series, but censorship was initially conceived to intercept corrupting and foreign influences from British and American magazines, and then the fact that the legislation was so ill-equipped to actually deal with magazines is kind of ironic.
It is. It's always surprised me that the exact opposite of what they wanted actually happened, because in the debates they say, well, obviously we're not going to ban books, and then subsequently all they do is ban novels. But the very things you complained about, the newspapers, kind of, like most of them are fine, it seems. It's a very strange result of a piece of legislation that it did the polar opposite to what it claimed it would do. Mm-hmm. Would also maybe because the Bell is published in Ireland that it helps to get away with it, as opposed to coming in, because the surveillance of foreign publications was part of the censorship machine, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the fact that it was printed in Ireland by Cahill's meant that it couldn't be intercepted at the shores in that way, whereas the Horizon's Irish number, for example, that was confiscated by the police on the usual grounds of obscenity. So yes, the fact that it was printed in Ireland would have made that difference as well. And yeah. Which
is, once again, another irony. The home-produced could get away with just a little bit more than the dirty foreign publications. It's such an interesting magazine from the point of view of the editorial line and the way it was received and the way it was read. I mean, there's just a lot in it, really, isn't there?
I think that perhaps also, when talking about how the Bell could get away with it, and of course it wasn't just the Bell, because between the 30s and the 40s, no Irish periodical was banned. It was only foreign ones. But I think for the Bell specifically, it may also have had to do with Pedro O'Donnell's personal connections, because I think he was good friends with 2 of the censors, Jack Piggott and Christopher O'Reilly. And I think that will have had to do with that. Well, these censors, they were professors at St. Patrick's Training College, and that's where Pedro O'Donnell had trained as a teacher. And in a later interview, he also stated that, they would never ban a thing that I was responsible for. So it also had to do with those with those things.
With the smaller personal stories that Irish life is replete with. I know your man and it's grand. Well, thank you so much, Phyllis. This has just been a fascinating glimpse into a magazine that I think if it was more widely available, we'd probably still be reading it. It's just been great to talk to you about how it was received and why it was and wasn't censored in its own way. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aoife. It was a delight to talk to you. And could I end with a call to listeners, actually, if they read the... Can I do that?
Work away.
Okay. Yes, if there's any listeners who used to buy the Bell, who used to read the Bell, who wrote to the Bell, it would be lovely to hear from you, and I'm sure that my contact details will be in the show notes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great idea. Anyone who read, controversial material, get in touch. Doesn't the Bell sound great? Shame you have to go to a university or national library to read it. It's not been digitised or anything, so it's still the preserve of a small and knowledgeable elite. Next episode will be about Liam O'Flaherty, another one of the country's rare socialists, but also a big name in mid-20th century Irish literature. I want to consider how he became a banned author not just an author of banned books. Till then, keep your hands clean and your minds filthy.